Welcome, everybody, on this absolutely beautiful day.
Well, you're spicy.
And I believe there's not a lot of announcements right now. Remember, Edu is giving a talk on Monday, President's Day. So sorry about the timing, but that's going to be excellent. So I hope you can attend that as well. And today, we're moderating Andrew's discussion here. So thank you for doing that. And Andrew, really excited about this project.
So Andrew is a fourth-year PhD student in economics here at IU. His research interests include political economy, public finance, and development economics. He primarily works on the political economy of fiscal policy, especially focusing on fiscal rules at both the national and subnational. He's particularly interested in how the design of those rules constrain fiscal discretion. He has a BA in economics from Hillsdale College and an MA from economics here at IU.
Everyone, thank you, Britt, for the introduction. Today I'll be presenting some work from a project titled A Political Economy Analysis of National Fiscal Rule Design. So an increasingly serious issue for many countries around the world is the size of their national debts. So the debts of many countries around the world have been rising tremendously over the last few decades. And so this graph shows central government debt as a percentage of GDP from 1975 to 2021.
Hey, we're not so bad.
Yeah. Relatively.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So in 1975, you can see that for all of these countries, their government debt was less than 50% of their respective GDPs. But now as of 2021, all of their debts were around 100% of GDP, or in some cases, much higher. And this is not a problem that's isolated to just these countries. You can see very similar trends in many OECD countries as well. So in response to this problem, what a lot of countries have done is implement what are called fiscal rules. So according to the IMF, fiscal rules are defined as long-lasting institutional constraints on the conduct of fiscal policy. And so fiscal rules can take many different forms, but they're typically codified as laws, and they typically have a numerical limit on a budgetary aggregate as a central component. So typically either deficits, revenue, or expenditure would be limited by the rule. So a very simple example of a fiscal rule would be a balanced budget rule, which is essentially a deficit rule with a limit of 0%. So you can't run a deficit. And these fiscal rules have exploded in popularity. In 1990, there were only 7 countries with rules, and in 2021, there were 105 countries with rules. And a lot of international organizations like the IMF and the World Bank have really touted the potential of fiscal rules as a solution to the debt problem. The idea being that, if you're running perpetual deficits, then implementing a rule that says you can't do that anymore would seem to be effective. However, recent literature has concluded that these rules have largely failed to meaningfully slow debt growth. And the major reason for that is that a majority of the rules are weakly designed. So they're weakly designed in the sense that they're easily circumvented. They're easy to get around, and there are loopholes built. So to kind of make this a bit more concrete, there are a few pretty common mechanisms to exploit weak fiscal rule design. So the first one is creative accounting. And so this can include things like moving certain budgetary items off budget. It could be making government assets appear more valuable than they actually are. It could mean, it can include disproportionately pushing costs of certain programs and policies into the future. There are many mechanisms and techniques that people can use. And the second is unrealistic projections. And so a lot of fiscal rules rely on ex ante projections for compliance. And so to comply with a 0% deficit rule, for example, a lot of times it would just be that you would have to have a projected deficit of 0%. And so you could comply with the rule, say, if you have really optimistic projections about the tax revenue that you're going to bring in this next fiscal year. But even if you run deficits, you've technically complied with the rule because your projected deficit was 0. And third is the abuse of escape clauses. So an escape clause is a part of the fiscal rule that says the rule can be suspended in some sort of crisis situation. So if there's a recession, if there's a natural disaster, a pandemic, then the escape clause basically says, you don't have to abide by the rule, and that gives you extra spending flexibility. Because the conventional wisdom is that you don't want to have a balanced budget. If the economy is locked down, you want extra spending flexibility. The problem is that a lot of escape clauses are either unclear or overly broad about when the escape clause applies. So for example, in the fiscal rule that India passed in 2003, their fiscal rule had a stipulation that the fiscal rule could be suspended, quote, under exceptional circumstances as the central government may specify. And so India was beset by annual exceptional circumstances, and the rule was basically rendered useless. And also on this, for the pandemic, a lot of countries have activated their escape clauses, and it's not clear when they're going to get back on the rule. Not clear how to unescape from the fiscal rule. And then finally, you can simply change the rule. So say that the first three mechanisms don't work, you're still going to hit up against the rule, break it. So in that case, you have a couple options. One option is to simply change the target itself. So if you're not going to be able to not be able to comply with the 0% deficit rule, maybe you can say we're instead going to change that target to 3% deficit. Or you can keep the same target, but push the deadline for achieving it into a future year. So we're not going to achieve a balanced budget this year. We're going to achieve it in 3 years, 5 years. Then again, you have the problem of, is this fiscal rule actually doing anything? And so how widespread is weak design of fiscal rules? And so in 2012, some economists at the IMF published a paper in which they calculated an index or created an index of fiscal rule design strength. So the index went from 0 to 1. This density plot shows the distribution of scores for countries' fiscal rules. And so as you can see, the plot is heavily right skewed. And so by these authors' index, at least, the vast majority of fiscal rules at the time were weakly designed. And so that kind of leads directly into my research question, which is, why are these rules so often weakly designed? And that's something that's not really addressed in the existing literature. I think maybe oversimplifying it a bit, there are two main strands, or at least easily identifiable strands of literature on fiscal rules. So the first one is mainly concerned with deriving optimal or consumer welfare maximizing rules. There are different assumptions about enforceability, information distribution, etc. So this could be, trying to find the optimal trade-off between rules and discretion, trying to find the optimal penalty for non-compliance with fiscal rules in order to incentivize politicians to abide by the rule, be about finding the right budgetary aggregate to target with the fiscal rule, things like that. The second main strand is evaluating the impact of rules on countries' fiscal outcomes, which I kind of alluded to previously. This project is kind of more related to the first strand in that, a lot of those papers, they do acknowledge the presence of political incentives on and how that can kind of affect rule strength, but they sort of take that as a given, sort of optimize around it. So they're not really focused on explaining the prevalence of weak design per se and how politicians' incentives affect the strength of rules. But a lot of historical experiences with fiscal rules in Britain and India and other countries suggest that political incentives do matter a lot in the decision of rule design strength. So there's a paper published last year that was really looking at the creation of and implementation of fiscal rules in Britain in the 1990s and early 2000s. And the author, what he did was he interviewed a lot of high-ranking government officials, finance ministers, et cetera, who were in power at the time that those fiscal rules were created and implemented. What he found was that, these rules were not implemented by a benevolent government to maximize consumer welfare. No, they were trying to take advantage of prevailing public opinion about the need for more fiscal responsibility. They were trying to remove a weapon from the arsenal of opposition parties and candidates that would promise to be more fiscally responsible than the incumbents. And so, it suggests that, you really need to take account of political incentives. And that kind of relates to, one of the main kind of obvious political benefits of a fiscal rule, which is that people generally support lower debt and fiscal responsibility. If you ask 100 people, do you prefer more debt or less debt? More fiscal responsibility or less fiscal responsibility? Everyone's going to say they prefer less debt and more fiscal responsibility. But if that's really the case, then why wouldn't all countries have a strong rule? Because if that's truly what citizens want, then why would politicians feel the need to build in loopholes to circumvent the rule if fiscal responsibility and lower debt is truly what citizens want? I argue that it's because a binding rule would necessitate consolidation. Because say in the case of, some sort of deficit rule, well, if the deficit rule is binding and you have to lower your deficit to comply, in the standard framework, there are only two ways of doing that. It's either increasing tax revenues or lowering spending, both of which are not politically popular. And something that voters don't tend to like very much. And so there's this weird inconsistency that some recent authors have picked up on, in that voters seem to want lower debt and more fiscal responsibility, but also lower taxes and higher spending at the same time. They want everything, but there's no such thing as a free lunch. And so voters seem to have these inconsistent preferences regarding fiscal policy. And so if you ask voters, they seem to want fiscal responsibility in the future, but in the present, they seem to prefer lower taxes and higher spending. So there's this time inconsistency. And when you're talking about time inconsistency, there's kind of this common or famous example of exercise. When in any given moment, you think, oh, in the future, I'm going to exercise. I'm going to get in shape. It's going to be great. This is really what's best for me. And that's what I'm going to do. But then the future becomes the present. And then you think, oh, I don't know about this whole exercise thing. It doesn't really seem like an optimal thing for me to be doing right now. And I think that's kind of analogous to fiscal policy in some ways, in that voters kind of projecting into the future, they want fiscal responsibility. But once that future becomes the present, their preferences seem to be different. And in the model that I'm trying to build to kind of reflect some of these concepts, the first main feature is that voters have dynamically inconsistent preferences with respect to the allocation of good consumption. So voters get utility from the consumption of public goods. Governments have tax revenues. They get tax revenues each period in which to produce public goods for voters to consume. In period one, voters have certain preferences for the consumption of public goods over periods 2 and 3. But when voters go from period 1 to period 2, in period 2, voters have different preferences. They would prefer a different allocation stream of public goods. So if politicians are trying to pass weak rules to cater to both period 1 voters and period 2 voters, well, if there's perfect information about the design strength of the rule, then period 1 voters aren't going to buy the rule. You're going to say, well, it's obvious that this rule is weak, it's not binding, it's not going to ensure the allocation stream we prefer, and so we're not going to, we're not going to reelect you, we're not going to give you any additional political benefits. But I think a very reasonable assumption is that there is asymmetric information between politicians and voters regarding the strength of a proposed fiscal rule. The politicians are the ones making the rules, and so they have very good information about the design strength of the rule. However, fiscal rules are very complicated. The political system and process isn't always very transparent. And even if information about the fiscal rule and its design strength was available, there's also a cost on the part of the voters to seek out and consume that information. And so in the model, I'm working with asymmetric information. And so because there's asymmetric information, there's potentially an incentive for electorally motivated and opportunistic politicians to propose a weak rule because it may not be perceived as weak. So there's this potential for voters to pass a weak rule that's not perceived necessarily as weak, cater to voters in period 1, but also preserve the fiscal flexibility to cater to voters in period 2, voters who have different preferences regarding public goods allocation in the last 2 periods. And so in the model, the kind of main trade-off of a weak rule for a politician is thus the potential political benefit of being able to cater to fiscal policy preferences of future voters versus the potential political cost of weak rule strength being discovered by present voters. And so in this framework, the main factors determining rule strength are the size of the potential political benefit of catering to fiscal policy preferences of future voters and the probability of voters in period 1 earning the rule strength. And so if there's this major potential benefit of being able to cater to voters in period 2, and that's going to be related to, that's going to increase the likelihood that a politician is going to want to propose a weak rule in the first period. And also the probability of voters earning the rule strength is relatively low. That would also contribute to politicians being more likely to want to propose a weak rule because there's less chance of the rule strength being found out, and thus the potential political cost of that is lower. And so the model, I think, kind of relates to a few previous empirical findings, kind of provides a framework or a lens in which to interpret them. And so one empirical finding is that countries with lower debt have stronger fiscal rules, which is kind of interesting for 2 reasons. One, that you wouldn't, these are the countries that supposedly need the strong fiscal rules the least. So it's kind of interesting why they would be the ones with the more strong fiscal rules. And second, is because I forgot the second rule, or the second reason.
Come back.
Yeah, it'll come back. But yeah, because but the countries with lower public debt, they have the stronger fiscal rules, even though countries with higher debt are the ones that actually need the stronger rules because they're the most conventionally in need of the binding constraint that a fiscal rule can offer. And the second empirical finding that I think relates to the model is that countries with more transparent finances tend to have stronger fiscal rules. And so this paper in 2021 was testing, does budgetary transparency affect does it impact the effectiveness of a fiscal rule? And he found that fiscal rules only seem to have any impact when finances and the political process are transparent. And so I think some questions that I'm kind of thinking about, first, does my story make sense? Are there inconsistencies? Are there weaknesses? In the way that I'm thinking about it? Are there additional, theoretical or empirical explorations you would recommend or you think that are needed? And also, I've been kind of thinking about this question of rulemaking in the context of a fiscal commons. And I know that there's a lot of literature out there about rulemaking in kind of a natural commons context. And in the work that I'm familiar with in that literature, it seems that they find that the larger the scale of the resource, the harder it is to make effective rules that govern it. And I think there's also kind of this interesting question of representation in the fiscal context where voters are kind of the beneficiaries of the resource, but it's the politicians who are making the rules kind of on their behalf. And so I was wondering if anybody has any thoughts in that context. I mean, I'd be really interested to hear that. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion.
I get up online too.
Dan, we'll probably just work our way around here.
Oh, no, you're up. Okay. One question and one comment. The question is, doesn't the cost of borrowing affect the determination of how much debt one should carry? This is a decision corporations make all deciding whether to use equity or debt financing. So that needs to go in there somewhere. It's not all politics. And about the opinion polls, everybody would prefer less debt. I'd prefer less personal debt. Wouldn't you? But do we want zero personal debt? Do we want to have to engage in austerity ourselves in our own personal lives? Do businesses? No. Right? Debt is always part of the makeup for everyone. And so I think the questions are sometimes simplistically put, in asking these questions. And the other thing is a hypothesis that I've long held. Lots of states in the US have strong fiscal rules. And my hypothesis is that the only reason that they keep to those rules at all is because the federal government exists. That if the federal government had its own strict fiscal rules, states would be blowing through their own limits on a regular basis.
Yeah, thank you. About the cost of borrowing and debt. Yeah, that is something that I did see come up a little bit. So why do countries have fiscal rules? Well, maybe it's because that signals a commitment to future fiscal responsibility, and you're going to have lower borrowing costs because of that, because the risk of default is lower. However, what some papers I've seen who try to tease out, is there a relationship between fiscal rules, their strength, and borrowing costs? They really don't find any strong correlation. You look at something, a country like Britain, who's repeatedly broken or amended their rules, their borrowing costs haven't changed as a result of those instances of changing the rule. So yeah, important point to think about for sure, but there's also the question of, I'm kind of arguing that voters might not have might have far from perfect information about the fiscal rule. It's also the question of, whether people who buy the country's debt or financial institutions, whether they have any better information about the fiscal and its design strength. So on that, I'm not sure, but Yeah, I think the fact remains that, yeah, the fiscal rules in practice today are becoming over time also more and more complex. And so countries have tried to, they kind of recognize that fiscal rules aren't working. They tried to make them more complex. That also raises problems for enforcement and the public's understanding of how they work, because you see them and they're like full of equations and stuff. So, but yeah, thank you.
Dan's question actually has caused me to change the question I'm going to ask.
I apologize.
Especially with respect to his hypothesis. Before he passed away, Ronald McKinnon wrote a couple of very short papers where he talked about the conditions of money and credit that confronted the government being critical in determining whether that government faced a hard or a soft budget constraint. The government faces a soft budget constraint, and it can be argued the federal government, the states does. Fiscal rules make absolutely no sense. One reason why we have them is for window dressing purposes. And I think your hypothesis there is actually bang on. You know, the voters like to see that kind of thing because they want to appear to be fiscally responsible. When in fact, every time we have a fiscal emergency, we spend more money than we take in, and it doesn't seem to have caused the downfall of Western civilization as yet. And so I think the voters, the time consistency problem, I think, is actually a problem because I don't think they're fooled. I think that they're much more nuanced in their opinions. So for instance, it doesn't matter whether it's Gallup or Yankelovich or Pew that does the survey. If you go back to around 1960, and they don't do this every year, but you can piece them together over time. The result of questions asked about the national debt and federal deficits, whether or not it represents a problem, the voters basically are saying, well, gosh, it's not such a problem if we consider the fact that, and this is their fact, right? They report that they believe that more than half of all federal, state, and local spending is waste, and that cuts will be relatively, easy to make. And that's more than half of all those polled. And, so as a consequence, I don't think that they're fooled by it, right? I think that politicians and the voters are together involved in a charade.
I love it. Yeah, no, that's very interesting. And I think, yeah, one of the reasons why I think fiscal rules are so popular amongst voters is because they don't specify what's going to be cut and whose taxes are going to be raised. Kind of a promise for broad fiscal responsibility, and then the details are kind of left undecided for whoever's in power in those future periods. And then when that time comes, you see what's happening in I think a couple weeks ago in France, the president was trying to raise the retirement age by like 2 years to preserve the sustainability of the pension system, and people were rioting in the streets because of that.
Well, now,
But also because they're French.
you also have to consider that, France is in a different position than the United States or virtually any other country that issues its own currency, uses a foreign currency. It's called the euro.
Yeah.
Right. And so they face a pretty hard budget constraint because they've ceded their monetary sovereignty over to the European Central Bank. They're in a very different classification than almost any other large industrial country that has its own currency, the UK included.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. It's funny. I was actually just in a seminar 3 or 4 weeks ago on modern monetary theory, where we read a bunch of stuff about how, soft budget constraints, US has its own currency. It can, it doesn't really face a meaningful budget constraint. I'm skeptical, but I think there's probably some, I can't help but think that there's some limit to what the US can do as far as increase the size of its debt. And I think maybe what matters more than maybe that reality is, I think kind of what you were saying is about voters' beliefs about what that limit is. So voters believe there's a limit. Well, then I don't know. I think that maybe matters a bit more for the actual policies that are implemented compared to what the limit actually is.
Jess?
Okay, so I first want to say congratulations on a very like professional and organized and very clear presentation.
Agreed.
Which is hard at any stage in your career, but especially like, at your third or fourth year. It was very well done. So now for the.
Oh, sure, yes.
Now she's going. All right.
We're up and out of carving.
Yeah. It seems to me that the question is not why do they with weak fiscal rules, but instead, why would they ever come up with strong ones? Not the folks that need it aren't going to do it, and the folks that don't need it can easily do it because no work. Right. And so that then leads me to the what I call the Skip Lupia question, which is why do you need a model? What is it that you are explaining that is surprising to us? Is it something or that you can't yet anticipate, right? Do you not have data that you then need to actually design a model that helps you understand the mechanisms that you should expect to understand, especially absent good data? Right? Do you need to name the parts or the actors and how they interact, right? The Kidd and Prescott have been talking about time consistency for 40 or 50 years now, right? So I'd love to know why a model is central and important to your discussion here. And that is sort of then two more questions about it. First, one is sort of has to do with, are fiscal rules somehow different than other rules that are meant to constrain government behavior? I.e. any rule that governments would like to demonstrate that they have because it matters to them because they are audience costs, right? But don't actually want to follow through with, right? Are fiscal rules the only thing look like that? And if so, I don't know, I kind of doubt it, right? But like, put it in some context for us. Does this model apply more broadly? And if so, right, is this really about when governments pass constraining rules, the kind of signal they're sending and when they need to send that signal? Which then leads me to the second point is this just about democracies, right? You're talking about voters when, as you pointed out very rightly at the end, it's politicians that are making these rules and actually have to adhere to them. At the end of the day, it's not clear why voters matter, right? Because at the end of the day, there's all these ways to get out of the fiscal rule, say, here's why we didn't do it. So the support level between period 1 and period 2 is actually unlikely to change very much, right? And so all of this is to say that I think you've thought through this and you've done the literature, and I sort of want you to, I got to push back against Dan and say, like, there's more politics, right? Yes, like,
Well, I didn't say there shouldn't be.
Politics doesn't
When you're describing my Peter Grossman refers to as the do something syndrome. Right?
So in other words, start thinking about what the model is meant to do for you. And I'm not saying you shouldn't have one, right? I love role models. But I'm Skipopia did it to me and I'm going to do it to you. Why model, right? Why do you need a formal model for this beyond just
That's like really just me. I forced him to write the model.
The economics department generally.
They're not going to accept it if there's not a model.
Anyway, it was a lot.
Oh, those classes. Oh, those are fantastic questions and comments. Thank you so much. Let me see. So you talked about first, why are fiscal rules ever strong? I think that that maybe connects with the, why are fiscal rules even implemented in the first place? Like why would these countries even feel the need to implement any fiscal rule if their public finances are doing so well? What's the point? I think
they're not doing well. Because they don't want to have to constrain themselves. Right. So
right. So the countries that have low debt, then why would they implement a fiscal rule if they're already doing well? So a couple of things on that. One is that so I focus in this project on national level rules, but there are also supranational rules that apply to lots of countries at once, like the EU. So the EU has its own supranational rule that's in the Stability and Growth Pact, which applies to all of its member countries. And I believe that rule is a 3% deficit. And in response to that, a lot of countries implemented their their own national fiscal rule to either complement that rule or to even stricter. They were going to have a 1% deficit rule or a 0% deficit rule. Now it could be there could be some politics involved in that. It's like, look, EU, we have this strong fiscal rule. We're really trying to abide by, the rules that you've set out for us. But I think, and also a lot of countries next to you have a fiscal rule that kind of puts pressure on your country to implement a fiscal rule as well, because voters see that like, why don't we have that? Why don't we have this commitment to long-term fiscal responsibility that these other countries have? And I think that those two factors may drive countries with low debt to create fiscal rules. And then once they've made the decision to create a fiscal rule, they're going to make it strong because they're confident that they can abide by it. And two, they seem to have less of a time inconsistency problem. And they also tend to have more transparent finance as well.
Okay, so you asked about empirical discussions here. In order to make that claim, it'd be really helpful to show not just that public opinion people don't want debt, but that they know what the fiscal rule is, right? And think that it's important, right? Most of us know only very little about our government's national policy and may know nothing about their fiscal rules. Right? And so if you think that there's a signaling game going on, which you're suggesting there is, right? I would love to know, and as part of your project, do people actually know what their government's fiscal rules are beyond just not wanting debt, right? Because I think that would lend a little bit more. Okay, so this audience matters. It's not just right. So who is the government signaling by making these rules?
Do they have to know and actually understand it correctly, or is it they know and they're wrong?
I think just establish.
I'm
no, it's a great
genuine.
question.
I'm
No,
genuine.
it's a really good
Okay.
question because it speaks to this other
Right.
point, right, about the opacity of the rule, and the
Right.
transparency of it.
Right.
But they could first demonstrate that it's important, that they know that this is even an area.
But they have an accurate understanding of the rule?
No, they don't need to.
They don't have to. Okay,
Right.
cool.
They would
That's
have
what
to
I was
know
trying
that
to
this
help
is-
see though. Thank you.
But other both, right? It would be.
Oh,
great
yeah.
to know.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, sure. And that's something that I've also thought about too, because there are some models where there's this kind of direct mechanism of learning what the fiscal rule strength is. Then there are also some kind of secondary mechanisms like reputation or something else, this guy's saying it's strong, but a couple of years ago he made that same promise about something else. So I think there's definitely some room for something like that to enter. And as far as the model goes, it's a fantastic question. And I got asked that exact same question a year ago. I was meeting with a speaker and I was telling him about my research, why do you need a model? And I was like, oh, I don't know. And he said, it's typically a model is, to generate, empirically testable hypotheses that are grounded in theory. And that's kind of what I was envisioning kind of as the next step of my project. And why I wanted to mention the empirical findings that are sort of related to what I'm saying. But I think that there's also some room to do more with that than just kind of cite them or recreate their findings. Let's see. Something about the rule. I don't know if there are more.
Yeah.
I'm worried about me talking too much, but
So-
yeah. I'd love to return to the other questions if we have time, maybe. Yeah.
I think a lot of people before me, so I know, it's like, I or you, so it's like, yeah, so. Go ahead, Mike.
Oh, okay. Let me follow sort of a contrasting view here. I like your model. I think your model's got some real potential. And I see you haven't fully developed it. And one of the things I want to suggest is that it does give us sort of a formal representation of why this charade occurred. Because the politicians have the incentive to act like they're setting up a rule and then also to violate it, and they're going to keep doing that. But by limiting it to these 3 periods of your intergenerational sort of model, that doesn't give the public enough time to learn about, because if the politicians set up one mechanism, I remember the Congressional Budget Office used to be seen as a balanced place for fair sort of information. Well, not so much anymore. But sort of they're learning, or the two parties in the US are sort of learning to undermine whatever the other one thinks is an unbalanced sort of source. So it seems to me that this, again, you're coming at this from an economics perspective. Are you sure this is really going to be an equilibrium, or are the people going to eventually figure this out and they're going to the politicians are not going to be able to continue to do this because the public's going to be able to say, well, that's what you said all before. And so we're not going to believe you, and we're going to vote for the other guys. And so is there a longer term equilibrium? And that might get to the kind of questions you're having up here. Those look more like long-term equilibrium kind of solutions, that the debt sort of matches, the rules match up to the debt sort of in countries that aren't really exposed in a debt position. They're going to have strong rules. The ones who are going to find ways to not do it. So you need to sort of think about the long-term equilibrium source. So there's maybe room for a second model here.
Nothing he'd rather do than develop a model.
It's a nice model. It's a good setup.
We have Ariana and then Joyce.
Thank you so much. This was a really wonderful presentation. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
I was surprised that you represent the voters as so unanimous in their support for fiscal responsibility. And I'm curious, is it really universally true that people, are people in so agreement that they all want low debt? And if so, where does that come from? Where does that desire originate from? Why? It's hard for me to imagine that it's actually universally true, but for the people for whom it is true, where do they get that idea?
Yeah. So I think, to me, it seems like the prevailing view. I think in the last few years, with the rise of modern monetary theory and some more kind of alternative frameworks in which to think about fiscal policy decisions, that some people have maybe different views about what the deficit should be, what the US can handle as far as the size of its debt. But I think that even if, because it's tough to, it's like, does fiscally responsible mean low deficits and low debt, or does it just mean, or can it mean also high deficits and high debt, but just used very intelligently, right? Because you can have, people talk about investments. We're investing in our future. We're investing in education. We're investing in, the climate and all these other things which raise our debt, but to some people seem very fiscally responsible because, viewed from a long-term perspective, they expect it to pay off. So I think that, what people mean by fiscally responsible can kind of complicate, what exactly people's beliefs are. But I do think that, I think it does seem to be a very traditional, and this is like a critique of the modern monetary theorists in that, the way people talk about debt is wrong. We're not, the government's not a household. We don't need to balance our budget every year. But I think that, at least in America, that does seem to be the prevailing opinion of most people, because and it's kind of the framework I think in which the public has kind of operated in the last few decades, just traditionally in general.
But I think you were first. Yeah.
Well, I just want to, my question or observation goes a little bit a different direction, and I'm going to follow on to something that Mike said.
And that is that in your last question about the fiscal commons, I think that you have a really interesting way here of talking about, you've got the overarching, how does it work with all of the different economies in all the different countries in the macro? And then, but if you look at fiscal commons in a specific way, like you looked at the origins of the Spanish banking system, right? The Catholic Church did it in the villages and all of that kind of thing, that if you took a look at that and thought, and maybe it is something about scale representation and play the two, like, are we doing this at the wrong level? And maybe there's a proposal in here that could be like, if we bring it down to a more commons, I mean, it doesn't have to be run by the parish priest, but more of a, in the subsidiarity kind of way, that these things can be solved on a local level and then work up to what the general thing is. And it goes to do the people really know what the deal is? It goes to that too, because if it's being solved and you know what's happening in your community, you're going to know a little bit more about it than what is happening in the EU in general.
No, thank you. That's really interesting. And that's something that I really want to, I think is a very natural extension of this, is to kind of look at the lower levels, like the subnational fiscal rules, because a lot, I think Dan, you mentioned the state fiscal rules. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting case because I think 49 out of 50 states have a balanced budget rule. 49 out of 50 states don't run balanced budgets every year. And I think it's some of the same mechanisms might be applying because those are self-imposed. It's like I'm going to bind myself. That's kind of a hard thing to do. Whereas what some countries have done is the central government imposes rules on subnational entities, so states or regions, and I think intuitively that can make more sense and it can be more effective because the central government has an incentive to make those rules strong, so the central government doesn't have to bail out those subnational entities. But then you get into the problem of commitment. So say the subnational government runs massive deficits, is in huge fiscal trouble. Can the central government commit to not bailing out the subnational governments? I think that there are a lot of interesting questions for the subsidiarity framework for sure. Thank you.
Although I think A10 had a question.
Yes, so a couple of comment. Once, so the budget is kind of a common pool resource. So I wonder how you are looking at it, because Ostrom was looking about the commons that is the village people manage it, but the budget is a common pool resource that it's not direct representation by politicians. So it might be interesting, how does it apply? Another thing is the rule is important, but I don't know if you check also the political commitment. It's harder to check, but I think it might still be possible. And I think this what makes the difference. I can say from the experience of Israel that this is what I know, at least until a couple of years ago, there was very much discipline since the 85 stabilization program, and it was basically almost apolitical. So, I mean, of course, it's part of the political system, but the budget and the Ministry of Finance is managed by the administration, and the minister is political, but he's basically doing what they tell him. And they kind of limit the political game to a certain number. So there is the budget. They leave every year kind of billions for the political game, but you don't go beyond that. So political commitment is important. Another thing, and this goes also to the design principle, enforcement of that. At least in the early years, you had the US monitoring Israel, and if you kind of, so you had like an external force forcing you to not to over budget.
Can I ask you, could you clarify a bit more what you meant about political commitment? Is it just that, how much influence the politicians have in the rulemaking process versus experts? Is that what you were?
Yes, so the political commitment was in the sense that the Prime Minister and the Minister of the Finance were committed to not having a big deficit. There is a ceiling, and we don't pass that. So even though there are political pressures, this is something that you tell everyone, this is off limits. We can talk about what is in this framework, what is in this pool that we can play, but going beyond the deficit is off limit, and it was bipartisan. So whoever was the Prime Minister and whoever was the Minister of the Finance were committed to that at least since '85. Now this might be changing now, but at least for many years that was the case.
Yeah. One thing that I am curious about is that it seems that a lot of the stronger fiscal rules tend to have the least amount of political involvement in their creation. So like, for example, Switzerland and Sweden, these were not rules that were made behind closed doors by politicians. These were rules that were, basically the government said to economists here, create a great rule, and we'll follow. It might want some adjustments and such, but we'll basically follow whatever you think is the best rule. And so there's this kind of deferment to kind of like an expert opinion, which gives more credibility to the rule and seems to be associated with stronger rule design.
So yeah, so that is kind of the case that the experts, the economists, they call the shots, and there is a limited play for the politicians. They do have a pool. They always leave them a pool that they can play with. But that's it.
Thank you.
Can I go now? That's 1 minute.
Here's a two finger.
No,
So two comments. So the first one is like, I was wondering to what extent is the reason we are thinking about this is that another strong rule works is the ability to monetize the deficit. So essentially overall, since the 70s and 80s, I would say now it's more difficult to just print money. So because some rules were implemented that maybe at the beginning were not pretty well followed, but now they are on average more, binding. Now you get this, no? So connected with this idea that maybe people learn, so maybe they learned that it was so easy to monetize. They put some rules at the beginning, they work more or less like this, but then eventually they become stronger and stronger. At some point, it's really difficult to violate those rules. And now, well, you do it with bonds, okay? So essentially, and then the second thing is a comment about the model. So it's like I totally agree that there is a heterogeneous demand for government consolidation, that many things could happen in that regard. It's like people that are in favor or against, but that doesn't give you what you really need to explain this, because essentially, so let's say that you don't like consolidation. Well, don't have a rule. So why do you want a rule? Let's say that a majority wants a rule. That gives you a good idea for a strong rule. So the tricky part, and that's why I think it's very important to come up with a model that really tells you the mechanisms, like something like you want a rule that you know in advance that is going to be very easy to violate. That's the tricky, difficult part to think about. And that is, in some sense, I think as a first pass, as kind of orthogonal to the heterogeneous demand for different types of consolidation. So you can have that thing, but at the same time, that doesn't solve the problem that you're observing with rules. No? So that's probably kind of another way of defending why you're essentially not modeling that different voters may want different types of consolidation.
So a few things, couple going to the kabuki theater nature of this. You mentioned that the United States seems to support austerity more than voters in Europe. And yet we see the exact opposite when it comes to actual policy at the governmental level. We see a lot more austerity in European Union states than we do in the US is completely Keynesian, right? I mean, it's just, in this, also in Europe, right, the deficits that's exploded during COVID and so forth. But austerity seems to really bite in Europe, perhaps because of the 3% rule as sort of a benchmark that's set there. Then the other sort of thing that occurs to me is the Republican Party of the United States is very hawkish on debts when Democrats are in power, but debts rise more when Republicans are in the White House than when Democrats are in the White House historically. So that would be an interesting. I mean, it just seems. I'm not sure, how to get a handle on all of that, that kind of stuff. But one other important thing to remember, I think, for modeling purposes potentially, is the government's also the insurer of last resort, right? And that's COVID reflects that. Depression era, right? All of Keynesianism is built on that as sort of an assumption. And if the government is expected always to step in face of those problems, then there has to be a substantial amount of give in the fiscal rules.
So we only have about a minute if you would like to make any closing statements, given all of this.
Okay. No, sure. No, this has been really great. Thank you. A lot of great suggestions. Very good comments. And yeah, there's so many good things to talk about still. But yeah, I'll definitely I might reach out to some of you more to continue the conversation. And thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Easy.
Are there?
Yeah.
Are there?
Oh,